Okay, so this is the Bible study for 2 Samuel chapter 17, verses 1 through 23. And the text says, Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. The plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. But Absalom said, summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say as well. When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do as he says? If not, give us your opinion. Hushai replied to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time. You know your father and his men. They are fighters and fierce as a wild boar robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now, he is hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, there has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. Then even the bravest soldier whose heart is like the heart of a lion will melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a fighter and that those who with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him, wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as the dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley until not so much as a pebble is left. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar the priests, Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I have advised them to do so and so. Now send a message at once and tell David, do not spend the night at the fords in the wilderness, cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying at Enrogel. A female servant was to go and inform them, and they were to go tell King David, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So the two of them left at once and went to the house of a man in Behurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. His wife took a covering and spread it over the opening of the well and scattered grain over it. No one knew anything about it. When Absalom's men came to the woman at the house, they asked, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? The woman answered them, they crossed over the brook. The men searched but found no one, so they returned to Jerusalem. After they had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform King David. They said to him, set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you. So David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. All right, so number one in our Bible study, remember that you can download a PDF copy of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And number one is a review question about last week's Bible study. It says, what has happened in our last Bible study in chapter 16? A, Ziba brought gifts to David and told him that Mephibosheth was in Jerusalem, hoping to become king. Wait for chapter 19 for the rest of the story. And that's true. We know, we talked about last week that Ziba said, well, Mephibosheth's in Jerusalem. He thinks he's going to become king today. We find out some more of that story in chapter 19. We didn't really talk about that in our last Bible study. We'll talk about that more when it comes to chapter 19, but you can read ahead if you'd like. B, Shimei cursed David and threw rocks at him and called him a murderer. Yes. C, David did not fight back, but continued his journey, humbly trusting his fate to God. That's true. D, Absalom got bad advice from Ahithophel as David had prayed and slept with David's concubines in the sight of Israel, like Nathan had prophesied. Now, I think this is bad advice, but maybe it was good advice. Maybe it was certainly not, we talked about this, it was certainly not the kind of thing David would have done. We know that at the end of that text, it says Ahithophel gives trustworthy advice. It was like the word of God. And we know that it fulfilled the prophecy of Nathan, so it very well could have been from God. Although it just doesn't seem like the kind of leadership that David would have wanted to establish. And it doesn't seem like Absalom is starting off on the right foot. But because Ahithophel is giving more advice in this text, and we see how God is frustrating it, and maybe we're not really good judges of what's good advice and what's not, honestly. So it's something to be considered. E, we find out that Ahithophel had previously been very trustworthy in his advice. So he had previously been trustworthy. Maybe this was good advice. Doesn't feel like the thing that the man after God's own heart would have done. But it certainly does fulfill the prophesied sort of punishment for David's sin. So, there we go. Number 2, what happens now that should be in, not if, in 17:1 through 3. So now Ahithophel's giving advice again. I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. So Ahithophel's giving advice on how how Absalom can, get rid of David for good, and telling him to put together what amounts to kind of a small force. 12,000 seems large probably to most of us, but in the time of drone strikes and electronic warfare and all of this, perhaps 17,000 doesn't, or 12,000 doesn't seem like that many, but I think or perhaps it seems like a lot because we're used to smaller forces, more directed attacks, but this was probably a small force in comparison to all of Israel, which is the other advice we'll talk about here in a moment. Number 3, does this sound like good advice to you? A, yes, attack quick while they are tired. So they're on the run. They've got women and children with them. So maybe they're not as sharp or as ready to attack. Maybe they're tired. They are still close. They haven't been able to entrench themselves somewhere. So yeah, maybe it's good advice. B, no, I don't think I would attack David at all. So my first read on this was that was my opinion. I don't think it's good. Like, let him go. This is bad advice. David, I don't care how many men you take. If you don't take enough, it's going to be a problem. But probably no matter how many men you take, I think his guys are going to beat you. So just leave him alone. Of course, if you leave him alone, he doesn't go away. And I think as long as David lives, Absalom's kingdom is not safe. So maybe that wouldn't be good. I'm not a military genius, believe it or not. I don't know what the best is. So then C says it's really hard to say. So maybe we don't know, but I think it's going to become more clear. As my first read on that was, that's bad advice. But then when I heard the alternative advice, I thought, oh, yeah, maybe that was good advice. And so let's kind of move on into this. Number 4, how, according to 17:4-6, does Absalom respond to this advice? A, it sounded just as bad to him as it does to us. Maybe. B, it sounded good to him. It says it sounded good to him and to the elders of Israel. And so this sounds like good advice. And Ahithophel's always given good advice. C, he summoned Hushai the Archite to get his opinion. So this is how Absalom responds. He says, I think this is good advice, but look, I got this other guy that was a trusted advisor to David. Let me find out from him. Number 5, how did Hushai reply to Absalom according to 17:7-13? A, Hushai told Absalom that Ahithophel's advice is not good. And he says, this time Ahithophel's giving you bad advice. It's not good. And so that's what Hushai said. Now we start to think, okay, Hushai is the one that David sent there to frustrate the advice of Ahithophel. So this is like, oh, maybe Ahithophel's had some good ideas, had some good advice, and that's why it needs to be undone. B, he tells Absalom that he should know that David and his men are fierce fighters. These guys are fierce fighters. So 12,000 men's not going to be enough. I don't care how tired they are. Everybody knows your men will be slaughtered. He says, look, these guys fight like a wild boar that's just somebody's taking their cub. Okay, they're going to fight, and you guys are going to, you better take more than 12,000 men. But it's always a trade-off, right? In military, how quick can you muster an army? You can get together a smaller army faster, and they can take off and take advantage of him while he's tired and while he's on the run. If you gather a larger army, it's going to take a lot longer, and you're going to give him the chance to settle in and be ready to fight. You better send more than 12,000 men. Send them all, then you will defeat him. This is all Hushai's advice. This is what he says. This time Ahithophel isn't right. This is what you're going to need. Number 6, how did Absalom respond to Hushai's advice? According to 17:14 and 17:14, it says, Absalom and all the men of Israel said the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. So not only Absalom, but all the men of Israel agreed with Hushai. They said he's made some good points. And honestly, he did, didn't he? I mean, this wasn't a situation where we're like, I know you're trying to turn this for David. I know that you're trying to trick me. This was not an obvious trick, and it couldn't be an obvious trick because the points that he made were all true. Yes, David is fierce. His men are fierce. And maybe we need to take everybody, because this is no guaranteed victory just because he's going to be tired, or just because he's not yet settled and entrenched in a good place to fight. So they decided Hushai's advice was better. Number 7, according to verse 14, who had the better advice? So here's where we learn what really probably was the right advice, the best military advice, the advice that God was frustrating or thwarting. It says, Absalom and all the men of Israel said the advice of Hushai the Archite was better than Ahithophel, for the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. So here's where we find out for sure, okay, Ahithophel's advice was good. This was the best course of action, but God was frustrating that advice like David had prayed. And if there's any question before, now we see definitely God is using Hushai to frustrate this advice. Number 8, what happened in 17:15-22? A, Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar so that they would send their sons to inform David of Absalom's plans. This is what David told them to do. B, they tried to send another messenger so that they wouldn't get caught, but a young man saw them and told Absalom. So there was supposed to be this, this handoff, because if they came in the city, then they would be seen, and Absalom was going to find out that they were taking this message to David. So the servant girl was supposed to bring the message to them, but even then somebody saw this happening and told Absalom. See, they went to the house of a man in Behurim and climbed into a well. So they had to go hide because they knew they were being pursued now. D, the man's wife spread a covering over the well and scattered grain over it to hide that it was there. So it made it look, I guess, like a table, or made it look like some kind of a space that was being used. They didn't realize there was a hiding space under there. I don't imagine this was a well like we picture a well that may have been obviously a well. It could have just been like a spring, like a cave with a spring flowing out of it or something. I don't know. But somehow she was able to cover it and make it be something else, make it look like something else, make it look like a table. And maybe it was something like what we would picture. Absalom's men searched, but they could not find them. F, David and the people with him crossed the Jordan to safety. So this gave him time, because they got the message to David ultimately. And then what happened in 1723? When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order, and then he hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. So this is a text that's really setting up the next text. And I would have loved to really study all of it together. But there's just so much going on here. And then the battle happens. And so we're going to take a big chunk next time with the rest of chapter 17 and most of chapter 18 as well. But a lot is happening in this text. And so this is setting things up. So we find out sort of the outcome of this battle in the next Bible study. But this is how God was setting up David's redemption, for lack of a better term, David's restoration to his rightful place. And all of this is happening by what was set up in the previous chapters, when David was leaving and he left Hushai behind, when he was praying for the frustration of Ahithophel's advice. I think it's significant here that there was nothing more important to Ahithophel than the fact that his advice was good and that it came from God, because as soon as he realized that his advice would not be followed, maybe he worried that he would be killed or punished in some way for giving the king bad advice, or maybe it was just his honor, that as soon as his advice was not viewed as the word of God, that was what was important to him, and everything was gone for him. I don't think this is what David would have prayed for when he was praying for the frustration of his advice. He really, I think, just didn't want Absalom to have good advice, because if Absalom has advice from God, then David could be in trouble. David realizes that even he can't overcome somebody that's been guided by God and empowered by God to do the right things. So if this advice gives Absalom the advantage, it's what gave David the advantage, the word of God and direction from God. So David needed Absalom not to listen to this good advice. But I don't imagine that this is the outcome that David would have hoped for Ahithophel. But it's all part of this story that's setting up the restoration of David to the throne in the next chapter, and then after this battle. So we're continuing on studying and seeing how God works all this out, and how God ultimately does not allow Absalom, who is unrighteous, he's not doing the right thing. David leaves it in God's hands and says, if this is God's will, I'll let it happen. But in the end, this is not what God was wanting. God was not taking David out of the throne here. And so God does restore David to the throne. And we're seeing the process of how God works that out.